Hey everybody, I am super excited today to talk to you about a topic near and dear to my heart, something I'm very passionate about, and that's how to create a culture of inclusivity. And I'm going to break it down for you in a way that I think is a little bit different than what I tend to see out there, and as far as people when they're talking about this. And so I'm going to start by really talking about the building block of creating a great culture, which is the individual, the person. And once you can't really understand organizational psychology and inclusivity at an organizational level until you understand the individual psychology and how that individual processes and patterns and all the different elements that kind of come with that. And so I want to start there and kind of do a deep dive on individual psychology and then go into more of the building blocks for creating systems and processes and to really create a culture that is not only inclusive but is really your greatest asset. And when you start to understand the correlation between individual psychology and identity and the patterns and things like that, and then you understand organizational psychology and those correlations, you'll see that your company culture should be one of your number one assets, and I'm going to dive into it. So before I do, though, those who don't know me, I'll give you a little bit of a background. Yeah, that's me. I think probably about what 15 or 16. I was goth, not a lot out there, but if you are, you're my people. I actually went through a lot of different phases. I thought it was pretty interesting through that young period. But uh, there's hope. I actually I grew up, had a family. It's my wife and my two amazing children, Mariah and Brandon. And I think one of the reasons I share this is because when I was 14 or 15, I was at a point where I felt like the whole world was ending. I was very emotional. I was I barely graduated high school. And just to kind of show that like there is hope out there. People can grow up and change. So if you have any teens that are in those stages, there's hope for them. I One of the things I'm really into is martial arts, and uh, it's one of those things where I've kind of done it on and off with my busy schedule as far as just being a father and a husband and running a business and my involvement in the community and all those different things. For a long time, it took my passion for martial arts took a little bit of a back seat. So I've been kind of doing it on and off since I was 12, and I've studied many different martial arts, everything from in the beginning days of like karate and taekwondo to later on competing in like mixed martial arts tournaments where we did everything from basically like MMA, so like kickboxing, Greco-Roman wrestling, jiu-jitsu, and things like that. Um, and this was actually, that picture was from a jiu-jitsu competition where I was in the ultra heavyweight division, and so you kind of anybody above 230, which I was just above 230, and so you can go with guys that are 260 or whatever. So it's basically just anyone above that level. So I went against some big guys and still did pretty well. Got second. So a lot of the things I talk about that I've learned, not only from business, but it's like my relationships, as far as like my relationship with my wife and like raising kids, doing martial arts and then running a business. There's a lot of correlation and a lot of principles I've learned through those different areas that apply to one or the other. So you'll hear me kind of, probably mention that throughout. And this is our our dog Blaze, another part of our family. I wanted to make sure we threw him in there as well. So as I said, like a lot of what I've learned is, especially obviously on creating a culture of inclusivity, has been through my business experience. And so I started Web4 in 2009, and this is my work family who has had a huge impact in my life, right? So I spent a lot of time with them. I've learned so much from them. And that's really kind of what's forced me to grow over the years, is some of the different challenges that I faced in business. And I am so grateful for those challenges now, but when you're going through them, they can feel like a lot. And it does, especially as you grow. You have to grow as a person to grow your organization. And so I wrote this book, Future Proof Your Marketing. I think it was 2019. 2019. Has it been 3 years already? So wrote this. There's a lot of the concepts that I talk about actually in here, because creating a great marketing strategy, I look at more holistically as basically creating an amazing company. And so I'll kind of share some of those concepts with you. Some of these are also in that book that kind of flow into this. And then there's another book that I'm working on right now called Give, Grow, and Be Grateful, which is more about the individual. It's something that is a passion project for me that I've been working on and really excited to kind of release and get out there. And so some of the individual psychology stuff I go into, I'm actually going to be sharing some of in the book before that. So I'll kind of touch on that as well. Now, we're going to go over a ton of information, and we're going to be kind of bouncing around from kind of high level concepts into sometimes like detailed. And there's a lot of information, so I'm going to have you stretch your brain out a little bit here. We're going to do a little bit of a brain exercise, get you going. So I want you to choose a number between 2 and 9. So get that number in your mind, whatever it is, and then I want you to multiply that number by 9. Okay. Now, you should have a 2-digit number most likely, and then add the first digit and the second digit of that number, right? So 2-digit number, the first, second, you're going to add those two together. Now, subtract 5 from the number you came up with. And then you're going to choose a letter that matches your number. Whatever your number is, just choose the corresponding letter that goes on with that. So choose a number between 2 and 9, multiply that by 9. You should have a 2-digit number. And you can pause this if you're watching it on video, and it'll be easier to kind of go through. I know I kind of go through it fast. But hopefully everyone's with me at this point. Once you have that, you add the first and second, subtract 5 from the above, and then choose the corresponding letter. Now, I want you to choose a country that starts with that corresponding letter. This is where if you're not good at geography like me, this may be a little bit more challenging. If you're on video, you can always kind of look it up as well, but choose a corresponding, a country that corresponds with that letter. Now take the last letter of that country, okay? And you're going to choose an animal that starts with that letter. So you should have a country, and then the last letter of that country, you should have an animal that starts with that letter. Now take the last letter of the animal and choose a fruit that starts with that letter. All right, so if you've been following along, you should have a country that starts with the corresponding letter. The last letter of that country, you chose an animal that starts with that letter, and then you took the last letter of that animal and you chose a fruit that starts with that letter. And most likely, you chose Denmark. And you have a kangaroo with an orange. And you're going, how does he know this? And if you didn't, it's probably about 70% of you or so that chose a kangaroo, Denmark with a kangaroo and orange. Otherwise, you probably chose Denmark with a koala and an apple. I won't go into the secrets of how I know that, but let's just say that there's some illusion of choice that's built into that. Right, and so I like this kind of exercise just to get the brain going, and hopefully you liked it. We'll kind of move forward from here, but so I'm going to dive right into this. Was this strategy when I released the book Future Proof Your Marketing, which was focused on not only winning now and creating an amazing organization now, or creating, I mean, that was focused on marketing strategy, but when I think about marketing strategy, it's basically creating an amazing company, because that's that's your marketing, and there's a lot of elements that go into that, obviously. So when I released the book, it was not only to do it now, but one that would future-proof your business for all the different changes that were to come, right? Technological changes, advancements in technology. I wasn't thinking at the time that it would be for a global pandemic, but a lot of the clients who had some of this already kind of built into their culture and kind of baked into the DNA of their organization did really well throughout. When I say really well, they did the necessary things and innovated in the ways they needed to do, and they did so quickly because they already had the right ideas, processes, and systems in place in order to adapt quickly when that happened. And because of that, while other companies may have gone to the wayside, they ended up capturing more market share, maybe in a down market, but when the market came back, obviously they had more market share. And so it was really interesting to kind of see how different companies responded and through that, and how they were resilient. And so this is about creating an amazing organization, right? This is the simple framework for building an amazing organization. And at the high level, I make it as simple as possible. This is for kind of C-level execs, things like that, and we can dive into some of the details. Like, number one, know and love your customer is huge. Like, that is probably 80% initially of your strategy. So when I say that, I'm not just talking about demographically knowing your customer, right? I'm talking about understanding your customer at a deeper psychological level. The better understanding you have of your customer, the better you're going to be able to deliver on their needs, right? And meet their expectations and wow them and create great experiences. And if you love your customer, if you truly are passionate about helping your customer and really delivering value there, if you're grateful for your customer, what you're grateful for tends to grow, right? And tends to prosper, and what you resent tends to wither and die. So just knowing that, if you can build that in as your process, because there's times when there's going to be friction and frustration in any relationship, right? But it's the same thing with a customer, where you have to be able to resolve those and move forward, right? But ultimately, you want to make sure that you're kind of building that gratitude in, because that's how you're going to serve your customer at the highest level, and it's going to give you a competitive advantage. Now, underneath this, I won't get into all the detail. Underneath this, there's a ton of research, there's a ton of work, a ton of different things that go into really knowing and love your customer, from understanding the customer's journey, understanding their psychological needs, understanding the specific steps and actions they take, mapping out the entire journey, understanding their keyword searches, and then it's aligning your strategy. So once you have this deep, in-depth information about your customer, their journey, their needs, you align your strategy. That's not only your marketing, it's your product, it's your services, it's your company, it's your processes. You're constantly working on aligning your strategy to meet those needs. And a simple way I think about it is, if you had this optimal customer experience, right? If you had this optimal customer experience and you looked and you mapped that out for your customer, and they went through every different aspect from the beginning stages of where just awareness to as they're searching. So say they go to Google and they search for something, and maybe you're not showing up. That's not optimal for you, right? You want to show up when they're searching for keywords that are related to you, right? Related to your business. If they visit your website and it's on mobile and the experience isn't that good, maybe that's not good. If they go to your website and it doesn't have, it's not accessible for users with different ability levels, that may not be good, right? So if you had this optimal experience, you kind of look at that and you map that across the entire customer experience, entire journey, and then you find out where all the gaps are. And then you're working on, you prioritize and align the strategy with those gaps, right? And so there's a lot that goes into that, obviously, but at the simple level, it's really aligning your strategy with that. And then you need to have I call it monitor, measure, and adapt, which is having analytics, feedback loops in place where you have your finger on the pulse of your customer, so that you're constantly listening and understanding what's going on close to an immediate basis, as close to an immediate basis as possible, so that you're able to react and respond more quickly, right? So this kind of flows back into the knowing and loving your customer and then aligning your strategy, because what it does is it allows you to quickly adapt and align your strategy when things are changing, when there's change in the environment, right? And so it also tells you what marketing's working. There's so many different elements that come into this, but these are like the three very high level things, and it's a very simple framework that works for creating an amazing organization. There's a lot that goes into this. Now, a lot of times, more so in the last few years, we've been focusing on the internal customer. For a lot of our clients, we do a lot of work for the internal customer as well, not just the external customer, marketing and everything there. We're working a lot on the internal customer and making sure that there's strategies in place around their internal customers. And we believe that if you want your external customer to feel like your number one customer, that you have to treat your internal customer that way, right? I shifted my mindset. This was probably like 4 years ago now, but I shifted my mindset from like thinking about our external customer and always focusing on them to, as we grew as an organization, realizing that if I want them to experience the way I'm thinking I want them to experience, I need to focus on my internal customers, right? I need to focus on them and take care of them in the way and make sure that they understand how the external customer is taken care of, because they're ultimately going to be the one working with the external customer most often. And so it's pretty interesting, but ultimately your internal culture is going to be reflected in your external brand, your reputation, your brand in the industry. And so let's talk about creating a culture of inclusion, right? It sounds easy, right? And for a lot of people, it's like, oh yeah, like that seems pretty pretty simple. Now, that's one aspect of culture, which is a really important aspect for creating a really great culture. And there's a lot that goes into it. We'll kind of dive into that, but it's a lot harder than you think. And so I'm going to break this down. So first I want to ask you, and you can respond out loud if you want. I think it's a great way to do it, but you can also just think about this. Like, what does for you, what does inclusivity feel like, right? A lot of times when I ask this, I get a lot of different answers from people, right? If you're in an organization and you're like, oh, this feels like I'm included, like it's a very inclusive organization, what are the different thoughts that come to mind for you? And so what I think of, and this can vary, and it's great to ask this question, but it's that you feel cared for and heard, you feel included and valued for the unique person that you are, and you feel a sense of belonging, right? I think those are all really important elements to inclusivity. Now, this goes much deeper when you think about it, as far as how it impacts your entire business, your entire like everything. Because when you have team members that feel this way, you have a higher employee retention. And when you have a higher employee retention, at least in our case, in a lot of our clients' cases, that directly correlates to a higher client retention, right? And so if you want to, it's one of those things where often the thing that you want to focus on isn't always the thing you want You want a higher client retention. You want to focus on higher employee retention, right? And that's not necessarily always the case, but you want to, that'd be one aspect of it, right? And so I'm going to focus on 3 really impactful areas for inclusivity. The first one is psychology. I think I love human psychology. I think we're such complex, amazing animals that, you know, have this incredible brain and incredible feelings and emotions and different ways that we think. And so we're just this really interesting. So to me, human psychology is very interesting. I love learning about it. I'm constantly studying it. And so we'll do a little bit of a deep dive into certain aspects that I think are really valuable and apply to organizational psychology as well. And so then we're going to do a little bit deeper dive into culture or the organizational psychology to some extent point and how that plays in. And then we're going to talk about how to leverage some technology to create um, more inclusivity in your organization. So first, let's dive into the individual psychology part. And this goes a lot into the knowing and loving your customer section that aligns with the larger strategy we talked about before. So when we think about individual psychology, there's a lot of different elements, and we'll do a deeper dive into this. Um, like, we'll kind of get layers into this because there's a lot of different layers. But I think it's important to understand how this correlates as you have you I don't know what the best term is, but you basically have individual psychology and your team organizational psychology will always be flowing together. And there's different ways when a team is really in sync. And you have high, like your individual psychology, people are operating at a high level, and then your team's operating at a high level, right? So there's a correlation between that, and so valuing the individual and really focusing on the individual, making sure that they feel safe. There's a lot of different elements that kind of play into this. Um, and hire people that are passionate about what they do. First of all, and this is challenging in different job environments. Not everyone. There's some jobs where it's just harder to be passionate about that job. But if you can teach people to, in those kind of situations, say it's a warehouse job or shipping or whatever, if you can, like, I remember loading trucks for RPS, and I was in the back of a truck where some days if it was 90 degrees outside, it felt like 120 in the back of that truck. And packages were coming down this long chute, and I'm in the back just sweating and just dusty and all this stuff, and I'm putting boxes in, right? It doesn't sound like a job like that, but I would make it a game. I was playing Tetris with the boxes. I was doing this, and I actually was like, if I'm going to be here, I'm going to enjoy it to the best of my ability, while I'm here. So there's ways that you can kind of implement that in those systems, but that's going to impact team and organizational psychology. And of course, the team and organizational psychology is going to influence and impact the individual psychology. And of course, you have the larger community psychology. And sometimes you'll hear people refer to this as big C culture, right? So there's ways that the external culture can influence this as well, especially when we're talking about inclusivity, because there's a lot of things going on that, like are purposely divisive among people, right? And so you have to be aware of that and kind of protect your team to the extent that's possible. Obviously, these are adults, everyone can do what they want, but to some extent, you want to create safety within that areas and create barriers around that are applicable for your organization and the way you want to go. That's the cool thing about this, is you don't have to be any one way. It's just choosing the way that you want to be and then aligning with that ultimately. So our brain is still to this point the most complex thing we know of, more complex than the universe that we're in. Like, it is one of there's more neural connections. I think there's, I forget the exact number, of 100 billion neural connections or neurons with over 1 trillion neural connections in our brain. So there's more than all the stars in our universe. And so our brain is this really complex organism that is so interesting. And I'm actually going to just touch on very high level aspects of it. I'm not going to get down into the nitty gritty because that's not what this is about, but I think it's important to kind of understand a little bit around it. So a lot of you may have learned this in like anatomy, biology, or something like that, but you have your neocortex, right? It's sometimes referred to as rational or thinking brain, right? And then you have the limbic, emotional or feeling brain, right? So sometimes if you heard someone say there was they had the amygdala hijack or something like that, that is part of the emotional or feeling brain, where we've created associations in our brain and memories of emotion, feeling, and sometimes those are triggered by our reptilian brain, which causes the amygdala hijack. So our reptilian brain is more instinctual. It's responsible for the moment of decision often, and it's very survival oriented, right? So this is when you understand this, start to understand people a little bit better, because there's a level of self awareness that we have or don't have sometimes, and sometimes people don't realize they're being driven by these subconscious instincts, and sometimes something that's used here is what's called the four F's: fight, flight, food, or fornication. Right. So those are drivers of the reptilian brain. Right. The reptilian brain not only keeps us alive while we're sleeping, as far as continuing to breathe, heart pumping, and all that stuff. So it's very valuable, but it's also a multi-billion, it's billion-year-old software that is just really focused on keeping us alive. And we're not in the situation where we're, fighting off saber-toothed tigers each day. And so we find things that threaten our security, our safety, our survival is what it feels like, right? So that threaten those things, and we associate those with daily things at work. If somebody else got this project over you, right, that could trigger a survival aspect because you're associating that to your certainty, your security around your advancements or income growth. There's all these different elements that happen there. So it's really important to understand how these different aspects work, but not to the point where you need to be an expert in anatomy or anything like that. And I think a very simple concept, which was coined by Sigmund Freud, was the pain-pleasure principle. What this basically is, and if you've heard of it, let me know, like in the comments or post it. I think it's a really good concept to provide another layer of context. That the concept in general is basically that everything in life, as humans, we're constantly trying to avoid pain and move towards pleasure. Now, there's not a framework that just everyone follows. It's what we've created associations with. So what you associate pain and pleasure with is not likely the same thing I associate pain and pleasure with, though there's commonalities, of course. You may associate like pleasure with working out and exercising, where someone else might be like, I associate pain with physical activity. You might associate pleasure with visiting your family. Other people associate pain with visiting their relatives. There's all kinds of different associations that we create through our life experiences. I'll actually talk about this a little bit more here in the riverbed concept, because I think I came up with this riverbed concept as a simple way to explain human behavior and kind of have a deeper understanding of our experience and how we go about each day. But the concept is basically that the water of the river, in this case, is like our thoughts, our emotions, our actions. So the acronym T, thoughts, emotions, actions, are like the water in this river, right? So they flow over the riverbed, kind of following this path of least resistance. And that riverbed is made up of layers and layers upon core beliefs. All those core beliefs are built off of past life experiences, past associations, and be created, as well as the deep, deep layers of your survival instincts and all those different elements. And so those beliefs are sometimes so far below the surface that you don't even know that they're there, that they're guiding you, right? And a lot of times people think, like they think someone else did something and that caused them to have an emotion. And in some ways they're correct, because it happens so quickly, they don't realize the subconscious processing that's going on and the meaning they're assigning to it. And so that's the way they're applying the meaning, their association with it. And so that's how they're feeling that way because of that, right? And so, but just like the water of this river, there's different states we're in, right? So I could spend hours just on this riverbed concept. So if you have more questions, I'm happy to go into it. But it's a simple analogy to kind of understand, like, one of the things that happens in behavioral change is there's a lot of focus on willpower, and willpower is important. So don't get me wrong on that. Willpower is extremely important, but it's not the end all be all. You can use willpower to an extent, but if I'm swimming upstream, my muscles, like willpower, will eventually get tired, and I'll fall back into the flow of old patterns, right? And so what happens when you're trying to do behavioral change is you use willpower for a little bit, and if you really want to be effective, you address the underlying core beliefs, the beliefs about yourself. Like a lot of those, when I say core beliefs about yourself, that's like, I am this, I am that, or the world is this, beliefs about the world, beliefs about other people. A lot of those are core beliefs that you develop, that because you have those beliefs, it guides you in a certain way, right? Like if you say, I'm horrible at public speaking, you might not ever do public speaking because you say you're horrible at it and you've identified yourself that. So one of the number one determining factors in where a person will be and how they'll respond and all those different elements is their identity, their individual identity, how they define themselves. And we will try to stay true to our identity as much as possible. And now there's conflicts within that. I'm not going to get into the deeper areas of that, but in general, we try to stay true to our identity. That's part of the riverbed that's guiding our thoughts, our emotions, our actions. Now, some of this is, there's a lot of nuances. Like I'm always the caveat guy, right? So there's always, these are just kind of a general guideline. There's a lot of different elements that come in as far as outside stimulus and all that kind of stuff. But in general, that's a kind of good overview concept of the riverbed. Our individual identity, our core beliefs, our survival instincts, all those different elements create the riverbed. And then our everyday thoughts, emotions, actions are like the water of the river. Now, if you're pushing back against that, that's good and it's normal. It happens. But I want to show you this additional study that was done at Harvard. Now, this was from a consumer behavior standpoint. And it was showing, as they're doing these brain scans, that only 5% of our behavior is being driven by that conscious mind, right? That's the logical, explicit information that we're looking at to make, these logical decisions. Only 5%. And so 95% of our behavior when it comes to, this was in making a purchase, but it applies across the board as well. 95% of our behavior is being driven by the subconscious mind. So it's being driven by that riverbed, right? And so that's kind of the analogy I wanted to create is, yeah, we have control and we have that, but it's important to understand the different states that we're in that do that. And so I'll show you something that I think will be super valuable for you to understand how you can turn this in your favor, because what I call like 95% of the day, we're basically in autopilot. That's our past programming, our subconscious that's driving that from all of our past associations, our identity, our beliefs, our experiences, and we're on autopilot for most of the day. And then there's about 5% of the day where we're in manual, right? And this happens on and off throughout the entire day. Now, a lot of people go, "Well, autopilot's bad." No, autopilot isn't bad. You don't want someone that is flying a plane to have to think about flying a plane. Like you want to be so good at it that it's autopilot, right? It's like your skill when you're at work. You want to be able to do it on autopilot to some extent. But if you are doing it incorrectly, right, or if you're doing it in a way that's not beneficial on autopilot, then you want to switch that. And how you do that, you can't change it while you're in autopilot. You have to switch to manual mode to then learn those things, apply those, and create new patterns so that your autopilot becomes even better. So our subconscious is extremely powerful. It's basically like it's more powerful than any supercomputer on the planet, right? But for everyone, it's not working in their best interest because of how it's been programmed. Everyone's had different life experiences and different associations and different things that impact them in different ways. So what you can do, though, is you can create new pathways, right? And so real quickly, I'll talk about neuroplasticity, and then I'll jump back into this because I think it's important that you understand. Because, for instance, I once had a belief that once you're past 25, you can't change, that we're pretty much kind of set in stone. And part of that is because some of the things I read stated that basically after year 25, you don't really change, right? Now, obviously that was kind of this core belief that was there. But if someone had that core belief, how likely are they to try to change if they're like, well, people don't change after 25, right? So that's a simple way of showing that there's belief structures that we create that guide us in certain ways or prevent us from doing certain things because of these beliefs. And so what's interesting is that's been blown out of the water as far as we can change. And there's something called neuroplasticity, and it's literally our neural connections and how they create new neural connections. And so where that original concept came from was that most of our neural connections start to solidify around that age. So that's kind of where that came from. But what ends up happening is, because as you're younger, your brain is wiring quickly and shedding things that aren't used and all that stuff. What in the neural connection space, it's what what gets used, you lose. I'm forgetting the quote. It's if it's not used, it losed. No, that's not correctly, but it's something like that, where it's like, if you don't use it, you lose it. There you go. If you don't use it, you lose it. And so when you use it, your brain actually becomes more efficient and effective, creating new neural connections or solidifying or strengthening previous neural connections, so that you're more adept and more efficient at doing that. Your body's more efficient, all these different things. And so there's a lot that goes into it as far as like understanding the neural chemicals and all that, like as far as dopamine and how that triggers. If you really want to dive into it, you can dive into it deeper to understand like dopamine and the reward center in our brain and how that actually impacts the neuroplasticity. Gratitude is like a superpower that's why I was talking about being grateful for your customers. Like gratitude literally rewires our brain to do more of that, because gratitude gives us kind of dopamine as well as serotonin, I believe, as far as the neurochemicals. And so it literally, if you have this gratitude, your brain says, I want to do that more. It's a great feeling. Gratitude is an amazing feeling. And so your brain will make you more efficient at experiencing that. So back to this, that provides a little bit of context to understand how, when you go to manual mode, from autopilot to manual, you can actually start to rework the underlying subconscious, the underlying patterns, the underlying beliefs, the identity that is driving you and kind of guiding those thoughts, emotions, and actions. So there's like, I could spend hours just on this aspect, and it's worth it, and I'm happy to jump in and more and focus on that, in which I have some other videos there on Give, Grow, and Be Grateful on my YouTube channel too that you can look at that go into more detail on this. But once you understand this, all of this is the individual level, and so it all applies at the organizational level as well, right? So once you start to understand how that individual applies, you can apply it then at the organizational level. One of the things I want you to understand is when you go from autopilot to manual, there's an acronym I use, STEER, obviously spelled incorrectly, but STEAR, and it stands for Stimulus, Thought, Emotion, Action, Result. It's a simple way to break down and understand and change. So if you're so one of the things the language I like to use in this is, if you're in autopilot and you want to practice methods to downshift into manual mode. And so you want to learn how to switch out of autopilot into manual so that you can steer, right? So it's kind of like you have a self-driving car, right? And you want to go back to manual mode, right? So you have the self-driving car that you've programmed, and you're like, I need to, it's got some glitches. It's got some things that aren't really working the way that are the most beneficial for me, maybe for others, for the world, however you want to apply that. There's different lenses to look through. And so you go over to manual mode and say, okay, now in manual mode, how do I reprogram this autopilot? And so STEER is an important part of that. So STEER stands for Stimulus, Thought, Emotion, Action, and Result, as I said. And I mentioned this briefly before, but what happens is most people don't believe or don't think they have that they control their emotions. They think when someone does something else, a stimulus, that causes the emotion in them. And like I said, to some extent they're correct, but when you look at it a little more closely and you actually understand that it's the subconscious usually that's triggering that, there's actually the middle part. And one of my favorite, Viktor Frankl, he had a quote, and I want to say it was, and for those who don't know, Man's Search for Meaning is a phenomenal book. It's a little dry at times, but an amazing story. Um, you know, he was Viktor Frankl was in Auschwitz, so Nazi internment camp. His wife was killed there, and he survived there. And he was a psychologist, and so some of this, he talked about the importance of meaning. And so one of his quotes is, he says, in the space between stimulus and response, there's a space between stimulus and response, and in that space lies our freedom. I know he said freedom, but also something else. I can't remember it right now, but it's basically power. I think it may be, he said, our freedom and our power, because it truly is where we start to gain control of the autopilot and how we can change, right? So that thought, the stimulus, thought, emotion, action, result, that thought, if you think of it, is what is the meaning I'm assigning to this? So I'll give you an example, more of a personal example, because I think everything's a relationship, whether it's with a customer or your spouse or whatever it is, and a lot of the same principles apply across the board. And so I'll give you an example that used to happen sometimes when my wife and I would get in a heated discussion, or a sometimes referred to as a passionate discussion. The stimulus was, we would get this, and maybe she was raising her voice a little bit, and in my mind, the thought I was having, or the meaning that was being assigned, is that she's being disrespectful or rude, right? And the emotion that would come up from that was like, there's a number of different things that kind of come into play with that. But one is that, like, you know, you don't treat someone that you love that way. You don't, so she doesn't love me. And there's all these kind of deeper emotions that are happening in the subconscious, which you don't always know about. So it's like, she's being disrespectful. I, shouldn't be treated that way. All those kind of things are popping up. There's a number of different layers of that. My action to that, because of that emotion, was to also raise my voice in some point, to kind of almost as a protectionary method, because I was feeling attacked, right? And the result of that was not positive for anyone in that experience. So what's interesting about this is you can run the scenario both ways. I like to if I'm assessing something that I experienced, I start and go forward to the right. But other times I'll start with, well, what is the desired result I want? And what is the most beneficial action or actions that would happen to that? And what kind of emotion would actually empower me in those situations, or series of emotions would empower me to take that action, to get that result? And what are the thoughts or meanings that are that would empower me to do that, and to feel that emotion, to take that action result? And then how does stimulus come into play, and what scenarios where the stimulus come up, right? So there's different ways to kind of look at that. And so what I did in that scenario was, and people have a challenge with truth. I'll just throw it out there. What we call truth. People have a challenge with this, because they're like, well, this is what's true. And the truth is that there are multiple truths and perspectives and ways to look at something. And you have to decide for yourself whether it makes sense to stick to one truth or find another truth that may also be true, that is more beneficial for you and will create a better result and outcome in the end. And so what I mean by that is, I changed when that situation would happen with my spouse, the meaning I would change is that, so one of the things is you start to realize, as you understand people better, is when someone's doing that, they have fear, right? Like when someone's hurt, like you've heard the saying, hurt people hurt people. When someone is feeling threatened or feeling hurt or something like that, they often defend themselves, just like I was doing. So what I start to realize is I would tell myself, rather than she's being disrespectful to me or she's, being rude, is I would say she's hurting, and she's fearful. There's something that she's fearful of, or that she's hurting. How much does that change your emotion, right? Like, that meaning changes the emotion. So when I was thinking the other, my emotion obviously is going to be X, Y, and Z. But when I say, oh, she's fearful or she's hurting, there's something going on, my emotion, like my empathy for that, changes drastically. And so it's important to kind of understand that, how powerful meaning is in this process, and understand what meaning you're assigning to something. And so I won't do this exercise right now, but it's a good exercise for you to run through, and I'll provide, I have this worksheet that I use. I did a similar talk at Washington Workforce Association up in Seattle in November, and so I handed out this worksheet. So I'll try to link that as well. But basically, stimulus. What stimulus what was the stimulus or stimuli that you perceived? What was the mental state when you were perceiving that, right? You may have a situation where you were feeling frustrated because of something that happened at home. You came to work and something else happened and it just amplified the situation, right? Or vice versa. You go home, you had a situation at work that was a little frustrating, and now you're at home, right? So there's different ways to understand what state you're in, and how the stimulus is perceived when you're in those different states. And then could your mental state have played a role, right? So just kind of going through this, detaching. So part of slowing down and getting into manual mode, and there's different methods for doing this, but one way to think about it is envisioning, like almost imagining yourself floating over this person that's you, and their experience of this situation, and really looking at them as, oh, what did they experience in this situation? What was the thought or meaning they were assigning to this? And then what meaning are you assigning? Is that meaning 100% true? Is that possible? Is it any way possible that there was a misperception there? Or did you have absolutely all the information? As humans, our ability to process information, to make good decisions, to not bring in bias is not very good. I'll just say it that. For people who actually study this, they'd say it's really bad. Like, everything we do has bias to it because of our associations, the way we perceive things. We might associate, because I saw this thing happen this one time, well, that's just how things are, right? So our ability to see patterns, like, we naturally look for patterns in everything. And so everything's a pattern to us. Like, everything we find, we're assigning meaning to that, and we're building patterns out of that. And so when you think that thought, how does that make you feel? That's a really important part, is when you think that thought, how does that make you feel? And then what do you become like? How does that change your state? If you didn't have this thought, how would you feel? What actions did you take? And then what was the result of those actions? And was it the desired result? Your preferred, right? So again, I talked about you can do this backwards. Like, what is your desired preferred result? And then kind of work backwards through this process as well. And I think that's a great way to do it. But I wanted to do a little bit of a deep dive into the individual psychology so that you can better understand the organizational psychology and why that plays such a big role, and why the individual is the entire building block, and why, if you want to grow an organization, you have to grow the individuals in your team, right? You have to grow that. And so I'm going to talk about some of the framework for creating a great culture, culture that's really inclusive, a little bit about organizational values, our patterns, our beliefs, our attitudes, processes, behaviors, and kind of dive into that a little bit more. So I'll talk a little bit about Web4. At Web4, like, our number one advantage is our culture. Like, that's our competitive advantage, is as our culture. And so as we dive into this, you'll have a little bit of insights into, like, how much focus we put on this and why we really focus on taking care of our internal customer as our number one customer and making sure that they're taking care of our external customer as their number one customer, right? And so when we talk about our competitive advantage, we always talk about our 3 Ps. We talk about our people, right? Like we focus on hiring amazing people, first of all, people that are extremely passionate about helping people succeed, that are very passionate about their area of expertise. Like we don't want to hire someone that's just like, oh, like I need a job. It's like in some scenarios, like we do certain things, like we do some internships and stuff like that, where it's like people are exploring different things. But for the most part, we want to hire people that love what they do, that are super passionate about it, that like in not every, I realize every industry has different levels of that. Like in our industry, people are really passionate, and sometimes they're really passionate about a lot of different things. So that's the biggest thing. First of all, is the people that we hire, our passion. When I say passion, it's our identity, right? That's what we stand for as an organization. And then over going on 14 years now, it's all the processes we've developed because of everything we've done to learn and grow and improve. We've improved our processes to where we have a very high success rate in the things we do, whether it's our internal customers, our external customers. We are very process oriented. And so this is a framework for creating a culture of inclusivity, right? So the people is the people you hire. These are the ones you nurture, promote, celebrate, right? The people that you put in leadership positions, the people that you give opportunities to, right? Are you being inclusive in all those different areas? Are you, like, this goes everything from your hiring to interviewing to training, all those different elements. And then there's who you are, right? Your passion is who you are. Why this is your identity, vision, values, your purpose, the beliefs, right? It's what you stand for. You're starting to probably see a little bit of a correlation. This on the processes, it's your systems, your decision-making processes, and how you do the ordinary things each day that lead to extraordinary results. So if we were to think about the individual in the riverbed concept, right, this is similar to that in that your processes and passion, right, your identity, your beliefs, what you stand for, who you are, your values, your vision are going to be the riverbed, right, for your organization. And the processes are your patterns, just like the patterns of an individual. It's the things that you do each day, right? And then the ordinary little things you do each day that produce those extraordinary results. And so just like an individual needs to make behavioral changes, there's the same thing that applies when you're looking at it from an organizational standpoint and you're trying to make organizational changes, right? And when you understand that for an individual to change behavior, they need to have a strong why. In fact, it's probably the number one part of what allows our brain to be more the neuroplasticity is having a very strong reason why, right? It makes it to, there's a lot of other little elements that help reinforce and go into it. But if you were to simplify it down to that, it's to have a strong why. So it's important that when you start to understand that and you're rolling things out at the organizational level, you can think about that as well, as far as, okay, we need to make a change at this organizational level, and understanding the shift of that and aligning everyone with the why, right? Why are we doing this, and why is this going to be beneficial for us as individuals and then us as an organization, right? And then your organizational identity. Now, I'm going to talk about a couple core things. So first I'm going to talk about this, and I'll talk about a couple core things as far as your people. So people in this analogy, as far as the riverbed, aren't necessarily the water, though to some extent they are, because you're focusing on hiring people that fit your values, your vision, that share your passion, that align with and are excited about the vision of the company and the purpose, and the work that they do. It has meaning and is purposeful to them, right? So that's really important. But then you need to engage those people to, just like in the individual, to reinforce and build that underlying riverbed, right? The organizational identity, to reinforce it, to develop processes, and always be working on constantly improving. I call it an upward spiral, right? Just getting a little bit better all the time. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to infuse inclusivity in your culture. There's a lot of different aspects, and I mean, like, once you get into the tactical elements, there's a lot of small things that have huge impact, right? It's those little things you do each day that have extraordinary results. But I think one of the most important parts is be intentional about who you are as an organization, right? This is your vision, your values, your purpose. And then it's the how you do things. It's how you show up each day. It's your actions, your processes, so that it creates circumstances for people with a variety of backgrounds and life experiences to feel heard, included, and valued, right? There were a number of, sorry, that's my dog there. There were a number of experiences for me where, one second, let me pause this. Hey, Blaze, shh. Blaze, sit. 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 Thank you. Good boy. Stay. I got it. I got it. Thank you. We'll see. That may be in the final video if I don't edit it. So when you think about this, there's a number of things that I was doing myself that, as I examined these, they didn't align with the type of organization I wanted to create or the type of leader I wanted to be. Whether it be in a brainstorming session, and this was like 5 years ago maybe, where I'm like, some of the actions I was taking wouldn't be considered inclusive, as far as like someone throwing out an idea and I'm like, oh no, that wouldn't work, and just squashing their idea. And it's something that I did quite often. And it took me a while to realize that. And I'll talk about some of the systems or processes we had in place that helped me realize that created that transparency, that allowed me people to feel safe to share feedback around that. Like all those kind of things are so valuable. They can be challenging too. We'll talk about that. But part of it, so an organization is going to be in large part following the psychology, the mentality, the mindset of its leaders. And now everyone should be a leader in the organization, and we'll talk about that. But you want to, first of all, ensure that your team is involved in informing and creating your identity and processes. One of the reasons is that people are much more bought into something when they helped create it, right? If something is just put on you and you say, here, this is what you're going to do, and you had no informing it, you didn't really play a part in it, you're not going to be as bought in as if you're like, you came up, even if it's the same thing, if you came up with it or you had some aspect in informing this to create that, you're going to be much more bought in. Now, the other reason is because it's simply, there's aspects that are, so there's aspects that are good and aspects that are bad. So I don't want to create a blanket statement that it's just better. But in certain process areas, it's critical that you have the people who are doing the work informing those processes. Now, there may be bigger picture things that come into play, like people like, well, this is the best way to do it, and you can kind of say, well, yeah, that would also cost 5 times as much, and the client isn't willing to pay that, right? So there's different lenses, and it's important for different people to understand that, and that's kind of the caveat I'm talking about with that. But in general, it's just having people involved. So like for us, we talk about the 6 pillars of our foundation, which is our purpose, right? Our vision, our brand promise, our competitive advantage, our core values. And, like you'll see here, gratitude is one of our core values. And we didn't want to just put inclusivity. So we wanted to infuse inclusivity into our organization. And the way that we chose to do that was by focusing on gratitude as a value and then providing context and more clarity around what that meant. And it's saying we're grateful for our fellow team members, our clients, and our communities, as well as all of the diverse people, backgrounds, viewpoints, ideas, and personalities that help each of us continually learn from one another and grow. Right? I've seen it often where managers will manage people that have similar personalities, and they treat them slightly different than people with different personalities because they connect more easily with them, right? And so it's really important that you start to understand how you shift and how you do different things because of that, right? So there's one of the things as you're building this is you want to have complete transparency in your not only transparency but repetition, and we'll actually talk about that here in a second. I mentioned this before, but inclusive leadership is everyone. We talk about this all the time, that there isn't a title doesn't make you a leader, right? It's everyone at our organization is responsible for being a leader, and that's how they show up each day, the example they set by how they do their work, how they treat other team members, all the different elements they do. That's inclusive leadership. And so one of the concepts is part of our identity. We have a lot of concepts and stories and what I call totems that kind of come into play in that overall identity. And one of those is the window in the mirror concept, which actually came from the book Good to Great. And so in the book, they talk about the window in the mirror concept. And it's something that we all practice at Web4 is when, let's say something isn't going the way you want it to go, right? Maybe a client's frustrated because the project is over time, or they just don't understand certain things and they're kind of frustrated, whatever it may be. You don't first look out the window at everyone else and say like, hey, like, what are you guys doing there, right? You first look in the mirror and say, well, what could I have done better in this situation? Did I provide realistic expectations up front with a client? Did I communicate that clearly with the team? Does the team have all the resources they need? You start really looking at that and focusing on what could I have done better in this situation, right? And then when things are going great, right? When clients super excited, websites launched, traffic is skyrocketing, leads are up, business has doubled, we've hired 20 new employees in the last 2 years. Like you have those great events. You don't first look in the mirror, you look out the window and you say, look at what you guys have done. Like, and you recognize the individuals for the work they do rather than starting out with pat yourself on the back. Now, big caveat here. This doesn't mean you don't hold people accountable. It's not at all what this means. It just means you start by looking in the mirror first, right? Holding people accountable is one of the biggest gifts you can give them, and doing so in an empathetic way. And so the other aspect of this is that you can slap yourself on the back too. You want to focus on your team as well. It's good to be proud of the work you've done. So one of the stories or concepts that we talk about a lot at Web4 is the ripple effect. It's proven that for team members to really enjoy and feel that the work they do is impactful is to have that tied to something that's meaningful, that's purposeful to them, right? Where they feel like they're having a positive impact in a way that's purposeful for them. And so it can be tough. Like I'll give you an example. It's like someone who's coding the back end of a website that doesn't necessarily talk with the client all the time, and they're writing code and they're developing things in the back end of a website. They may not always see as much the impact for the client. And so we need to surface that all the time, right? We need to make sure we're surfacing that so that people see and feel the impact of the work that they're doing in a meaningful way. And so when we talk about the ripple effect, it's actually something my mother infused in me from a very young age. She'd always say that, um, she said that basically it's like, she's like, our everyday actions are like when you drop a pebble in a pond and it creates ripples that spread out across the entire pond. Our everyday actions are like that, where even the smallest of action can have a huge ripple effect, right? And so it's not that can we change the world or have an impact? It's that you're having an impact regardless, either way. It's just, is that positive or is it negative, right? Are you having a positive ripple effect or a negative ripple effect? And sometimes there's both. But you want to you want to focus more on the positive ripple effect and creating that kind of positive ripple in the world. So we do a lot of things, whether it be with nonprofits or charities or the different organizations we support, all the different things we do to have this positive ripple effect in our community for our team members, for our clients. And so it's a concept that, and there's different concepts that each business is going to have as part of their identity, as part of their organization, that help, align people and help remind people of things that are important to do. And that's one of them. This is just a story. I actually did a talk at Van Talks. I think that was around, gosh, it's been maybe 4 or 5 years now. But I did this talk at Van Talks, and this Cheagle was a character in the story that I told. I'm not going to go into all of that right now, just for time's sake. But if you want to listen to it, it's about a 12-minute, kind of like a TED Talk, but it was in Vancouver, Washington. It was at web4.com/Cheagle. So that's just another story, an element that's part of our experience as an organization and our identity. So we talked a lot about the passion, the identity side. Let's talk a little bit about the processes. These are the way you do things every single day. Those often seemingly ordinary things, but have an extraordinary impact. So this is, in order to create an organization that has a more inclusive feeling to it, it's important to and it's made different, it may be different for many different organizations, but how often you review these things and things like that. But if you haven't reviewed in a while, it's important to do. So like when you're having meetings, is there a meeting agenda that's as part of that? So when people are coming to the meeting, they know what's the meeting is about. Not only is it create a more inclusive feeling, it also is more efficient and effective in that scenario, and you're using your time better, right? So, and then in your interviewing process, like what different things are you doing in your interview process in order to, A, make the person feel included, and B, determine fit for the organization. We've incorporated a lot of different questions around how people value different elements of inclusivity, of diversity, of ideas, of people, of personalities, of all the different elements of and it's important to understand that, in interviews, sometimes people are going to put their best foot forward, and there's ways to bring in story and past experiences where they tell you a past experience to obviously do that. But the same thing applies to other processes. Your hiring, your onboarding. You want to create a great onboarding experience for your internal customers. There's something called primacy and recency in psychology, whereas people you remember the start of a relationship and you remember some of the most recent things, right? And in the middle, it's a little more blurry. You can remember a lot of different elements, but you remember that beginning part and you remember the most recent things. And so it's really important that you understand that as you're thinking about creating an onboarding and making someone feel welcomed and feel that they belong there. And then how are you doing performance evaluations? Is that process inclusive? Is there bias being removed across the board from that? Same with compensation. Reviewing your compensation, making sure that there's not any bias in how people are being compensated, that it's based on, we've created a lot of transparency in how we determine compensation, right? So we have a document that outlines exactly how we determine compensation so that team members know, we want you to game the system, we want you to make more money, and this is how we do that, right? So transparency is key and clarity is key in this. And then weekly meetings and things like that, Um, One of the other elements that I talk about a lot is questions. Questions are extremely powerful because questions guide our attention, right? If I asked you, what did you have for breakfast? You start thinking about what you had for breakfast, right? And so where our attention goes is where our energy goes. And if you when you when you really understand this, um, the simplest form of this is getting clear about your intentions and then aligning your attention with your intentions. I'll repeat that. So, getting clear about your intentions and then aligning your attention with your intentions, right? Kind of goes back to a little bit of that first strategy. But as an organization, as an individual, that is a really important thing to understand is how are you focusing attention consistently in the areas that are valuable to you as an organization that creates an inclusive organization, that you're asking questions maybe that you don't think about because you don't have that perspective. And so it's important to get different ideas in, which are you encouraging diverse ideas, right? That was something I mentioned before. I unknowingly, to some extent, it was just kind of more like a reaction because I make quick decisions and I sometimes move fast. And so I had to learn how to slow down, especially as I wanted to develop other people and empower them. And I'm doing the opposite. Like I'm having a negative impact on them as opposed to a positive impact on them, right? And so are you encouraging diverse ideas? Sometimes asking for it, like, why wouldn't this work? What are some different reasons why this wouldn't work, right? And then you want people to share different opinions, and then you want to make sure your technology is accessible to everyone. There's a lot more like we can talk about, and there's a lot of tactical actions you can do right away, like consistent surveys, surveys where you're also focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion, belonging, questions where people feel welcomed. And sometimes people get very focused on diversity being one segment of diversity, and that's one perspective as well, and that's good to understand that because it's like there's a lot of different aspects that go into diversity, right? So there's a lot of different elements that come into play, and there's a lot of different ways that we can make people that have different life experiences and come from different backgrounds feel included in an organization, right? So like at Web4, we have a committee that is what we call TEX, Team Experience. And they're focused, they have diversity, equity, inclusion kind of focus. They have things for events where they want to focus on kind of just group camaraderie and things like that. And then we've set up some group discussions. We do like lunch and learns and things like that. We do a lot of training. We bring people in from outside the organization as well. And we solicit anonymous feedback. That's actually something that is extremely valuable, and I'll share a tool with you for that. And then, like allowing for pronouns and emails and tools is a very simple thing that you can implement right away. Inviting guest speakers, and that's actually been really valuable for us, is to have someone come in from an outside perspective and share different ideas. And I found that really opens people up to a different way of thinking. We had a great thing where we all kind of went through this diversity exercise, and we listed out how many of our close friends that we really trust kind of fall in all these different categories. And it was not only, it was race, of course, but it was also religion, political, age, education level. Like there was a lot of different aspects, levels of ability, different things like that. Where so that tells you a little bit. Your bubble, the bubble that you're in, is known to you and is safe to you. And the people who are outside your bubble, right, you don't have as much experience with, the unknown is a little more scary to this subconscious. And so you have to be kind of aware of that as you're going through this process. So all those different perspectives are super valuable. And then ensure your website is ADA compliant. That's just something that really everyone should be doing. Make sure that your website's accessible to people with vision impairment, hearing, people who have seizures. There's probably 10 to 20% of users that are going to your website that have different levels of ability, and whether it be cognitive or different areas that play a big impact. So not only is it good for your business, but it's just the right thing to do. Then this is something that we implemented, I want to say like 7 years ago, and it's been so cool to see when you assign a decision to someone. So we developed this decision-making process. So it's very transparent about how we make decisions at Web4 and what to do if you're assigned a decision, because we could hire someone and in their first 3 months, we could assign them a decision. We could say, hey, you're going to make the decision on this. Now, there's a whole element that goes into choosing the right person to make a decision, and there's certain parameters that kind of fall into that. Of course, they have to consult with at least 3 people, but they're not coming and saying, here's our recommendation. They're coming and saying, here's the decision that I made, and here's how we're moving forward. It's extremely, you're putting a ton of trust into this person, but with that and with the right kind of bumpers in place, budgets and bumpers is one of the terms I use a lot, the right kind of budgets and bumpers in place, you really put a lot of trust and you empower that person to make decisions. And you start creating an organization that is less dependent on an individual and more like nimble and willing to take action and innovate within kind of preset scopes. Super, super, super beneficial. One of the acronyms I think of a lot, and I've mentioned some of these, is CAR. Most of these acronyms you see is kind of cost the auto level from autopilot to steer to CAR. But I feel it just kind of helps keep things in context. So CAR stands for clarity, alignment, action, repetition, recognition, and reward. So this is really important. I mentioned this a little bit when I was talking about values, right? You could have just terms for values, and if you asked 20 people on your team, you'd get 20 different meanings of what that value meant, right? And so you want to provide more context, more clarity to what certain things mean around your identity. You want clarity of vision, right? You want do people understand the vision? Where are we going? And are people aligned, right? Remember I talked about the why being a really important element, being a really strong driver, is the organizational why. So if you have goals, are those transparent and shown to the entire organization? Do those align with team goals? Are the team developing their goals around that bigger goal and around that bigger vision? And is the individual also, it doesn't mean that all their goals have to be aligned with that, of course, but do they see that, and do they see themselves having a positive future within that organization and continuing to progress and grow? And are they meeting some of their goals and their needs and their whys through that as well, right? And so that is a really, really critical element to understand, is alignment, right? Because we can all be we can all be working really hard but rowing in different directions, and that's not going to be as powerful as if we are all aligned, rowing in the same direction, just consistently rowing in that direction, right? And then action. You can, if you sit there and actually talk a lot and don't actually follow it up with action, not only it will actually be more detrimental because you're saying things and you're not following through on them, so you're eroding trust. So you need to take action as well. That doesn't mean that if someone gives feedback, you take action on every single thing. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying if there isn't if there is something where you're communicating, especially that you're going to take action, you need to follow through. And then action, speak, right? You've probably heard that that words speak, actions scream, or something like that. That's close to that. So your actions and following up with that and moving forward are going to be really, really valuable to reinforcing your identity, to reinforcing your processes. And then repetition. Repetition is the key to learning. It's the key to developing new habits. So if you have, whether it's your identity, one of the mistakes that I made, and I remember this vividly, it was probably about 5 years ago. I was sitting in an all-team meeting, and I asked a question about some of the aspects of our identity. I asked a question, and everyone kind of looked at each other, and no one answered the question, and so no one really knew. And I felt myself getting frustrated with them. And I quickly realized that that's on me. I followed the window in the mirror concept. I was like, That's my fault. I assumed everyone knew how important identity was and had been doing the different things to reinforce it, to understand it, to learn it, all those different things. And so now from that, I was like, light bulb. I was like, I need to take the same kind of approach that we do with our external customers and potential external customers in certain things, and I need to apply that to some extent to our internal customers. So we're constantly reinforcing our identity, our brand, our vision, our values, our purpose throughout different tools, throughout our meetings, throughout different things, when we reward someone, right? So if you're recognizing someone, that's a great opportunity to reinforce that individual and tie it to a value, tie it to something that they did that aligns with the organizational value or aligns with some of the concepts or stories. In that, those are all opportunities to repeat that and really reinforce that organizational identity and create a great kind of team culture. And then reward, right? I talked about more about the reward center in the brain and how that applies to different things. And one of the cool things that we learned a while back, and this was actually one of those, we assigned a decision to a team member, and they came up with this tool because we were basically looking for a way to get feedback. And so they came up with this tool. I'll actually share it with you here in a second. And it's one of the best tools we ever invested in. And it provided anonymous feedback, but so much more as well, which was really, really, really cool. So they made that decision. And there's another tool we had that came shortly after that, because in that tool, what we found was that people really valued and appreciated the recognition they received and thought it was done well and valuable, but that the frequency wasn't as high as they'd like. And that was pretty consistent over a period of time. And so we said, let's look for a solution to this. And so we found another situation where we assigned a decision, and that the solution that came up with that allowed us to kind of democratize that both recognition and reward a little bit across the team more effectively. Because you want to make sure, there's a couple things. One is certain organizations, if they're getting information and they're waiting to provide feedback on that. So like, I'll give you an example of one of the people I talked to at my last talk. They said they do an annual survey of their employees, and then that goes in, and then they don't really hear anything back for that for like 6 months. And I told them, I said, that's almost useless. Like, it's a waste of money. Like, let me just put that out there. It's a waste of money. You almost shouldn't be doing it, because if say you have you have a kid that every time they do something, you bring it up 6 months later, they've been doing that thing for a long time, so they've repeated and created that pattern, right? But B, that feedback isn't timely, right? It's not timely. So when you're giving recognition or reward, or you're holding people accountable for some of the things, it needs to be closer to the actions that are happening, right? So it needs to be closer to that to help be more effective. And so you need to have something that's ongoing, quarterly it would be the minimum, I'd say, but you really should be doing something way more often than that in this day and age, in my opinion. And so there's ways to get that feedback, and that's one of the most valuable things. These are your internal customers, and their feedback, the information they provide is just like your external customer feedback. When they provide you all this information, it's some of the most valuable. They're telling you how to take care of them, how to make them feel special, how to fulfill their needs, right? So, and then all you have to do is do that. So it's not in all cases, obviously not everything makes sense, but it's like, it's so incredibly valuable. So be careful what you reward, though, and punish. Like, you don't want to punish lack of results always, or lack of outcome. You want to reward the effort. And if someone is following, like if you value innovation and people are innovating in the name of something positive, but it doesn't work, if you punish that or don't recognize the effort in that, then it actually stifles innovation, right? So as you start to understand some of these different things and apply them, you'll start to see people innovating more. they feel safe to put their neck out there, so to speak. They feel safe to make mistakes. You want people to be able to make mistakes within those bumpers, right? As long as they're working towards this, you want them to be able to test and try different things. There's a lot of other things that go into just making employees feel like, obviously there's purpose, meaning, autonomy, their ability to choose how they do work, all those kind of things, really, really important. But, and then training. My focus is not on growing the company. My focus is on growing the people within our organization. And if I grow the people within our organization, the company will grow, right? So it's really important to understand that. And my focus is on developing high-level leaders, right? So it depends on where you're at in your cycle, but training is always critical. And one of the things we talk about a lot at Web4 is emotional intelligence is one of our superpowers. It's something that's why we're so good with some of our clients, especially when they're in different situations, because we realize that the VP of marketing for this large organization has a lot of weight on their shoulders, right? We realize that. We realize that they're being pulled in all these different directions, that they have to answer to their the executives of the organization, as well as take care of this, and then they have us. So they might be coming to us with, in a certain state, kind of stressed in certain scenarios, and we still need to be able to process that and not be driven by the emotional drive that puts us in the wrong direction. We need to be aware of that and be able to redirect it into the right direction so that they're successful ultimately, but also provide them with what they need in order to succeed for them, right? So there's one of the reasons that we're really good with large organizations, small as well, but some of the large organizations is because one of the biggest roadblocks is getting shit done. Getting things done and people understanding why it needs to be done and getting approval to get it done. So we can actually work through that and speak to the C-level more effectively. There's a lot of things, but emotional intelligence is a superpower, and so much so that there's a time where I was considering changing my title from CEO to CEIO, Chief Emotional Intelligence Officer, because I think it's that valuable. And here's why. If I'm developing leaders, self-awareness is key, right? That's when they start to understand themselves, understand how they process things, how they're experiencing things, and then they start to manage themselves more effectively, right? And you think, well, everyone has this. Well, and yes, to some extent, but there is a much higher level. Like when I do martial arts, you start to think, oh, I got this, I'm really good, and then you realize, oh, whoa, no, I'm still way down here. There's this whole other level, right? And so being able to control your own emotion, being able to adapt, being able to change your own behavior, being able to control your mindset and have a positive outlook when you have a lot of different things going on, right? So there's so many different elements. And then you start to develop social awareness, which is having better empathy for other people on your team. And then you have organizational awareness. So you're not just looking at what's important for you and your things. You're looking at the rest of the team. You're looking at the organization and these different perspectives. You're able to do perspective taking and take these different perspectives and find that common ground that is going to make sense and be successful for the individuals as well as the organization. And then you get really good at relationship management, which is influencing others and training, coaching, and mentoring them. You're better at managing conflict because that's always going to happen, right? And not having unrealistic expectations of this perfect environment where it doesn't happen. And it's the same in a relationship where if you're in you have a partner and there's always going to be some conflict, but being able to do that more effectively. And teamwork and just inspirational leadership. So these are all some of the big things that are really important to help build your team members so that you're more inclusive as an organization, that you're more effective as an organization. And technology is also super valuable. There's so many different aspects. I'm just going to focus on a couple, but one of the big things is feedback loops. To me, it's one of a big advantage for us and for a lot of our clients that we're able to help them get this set in place is having feedback loops where you have your finger on the pulse of your customer. So for our internal customers, we use a tool called Office Vibe. We implemented this, it's probably been 4, maybe 5 years now. But when we implemented this, I'll just be very transparent. It was a little challenging to my understanding and my view of our organization and the identity of our organization. A lot of the feedback I was getting was at conflict with how I saw things, and that was hard. That was really hard for me to get. So it's important to understand that there might be a period of time where, and you can kind of see in this chart as we grew and grew and grew, and the overall engagement score and all the different elements. So tracking relationship with manager, alignment, ambassadorship, happiness, all that, satisfaction, recognition, personal growth, all these different areas. And then having individuals that provide anonymous feedback, answer questions, and all this data goes into us then going, oh, how can we make this better? How can we improve this? How can we do this? Or how can we create more clarity around the why we're doing it this way? There's all these different elements that go into it. But when you have your finger on the pulse of your internal customer, you're able to respond quickly. And if you don't have metrics in place, when you make changes, you're not going to necessarily know how those changes were positive or negative, right? And so it's the same with some of our marketing customers and external customers and all the things like that. We want to have those metrics in place so that we see what's working, what's not working, what needs to be improved, what we need to double down on, and all that kind of stuff. And that was something we've seen a lot here. You can see, actually, I don't think this shows it, but according to Office Vibe, we are in the top, I think it's the top 5 or percentile of all of their companies in the entire world as far as our overall engagement and team satisfaction. And that translates to our employee retention as well, which translates to client retention, as I said. So different things like this, you have people that provide feedbacks. What makes you want to share your suggestions with your organization? And I saw this feedback and it was awesome. There's constructive feedback as well, but I thought this was really cool and kind of goes to what we're talking about. So our team is very interested in each of our unique opinions, which allows us to feel safe and open to express things without feeling like we are less than them. I have felt and seen that each member of our team truly listens and takes into consideration your suggestions. And people can make themselves anonymous, right? But they don't have to. They can make themselves known as well. And I just replied. So that makes me smile to know how you feel that way and you've had those experiences. Thanks for taking your time to share. So that feedback and that communication creates a safe environment. It creates an environment where people that may not feel comfortable sharing something that's happening in your organization that may be detrimental to it can share it anonymously. Now, of course, there can be negatives to that as well. And you have to, if you have a management team who's managing this, I always recommend that they go in. Now I'd say 95% of our the feedback in there is all like super positive, which is great. And there's about 5% that's constructive, and that constructive is also now being delivered in a way that's more effective, meaning that people tend to not just be venting. Sometimes there's venting, which is okay, but they're not just venting, but they're talking about a challenge, and they're also offering up solutions sometimes, which is something we've had to train the team on over time, is just kind of share that this is a more effective way. Just like if I provided you feedback as a team member and I said, hey, this sucks that you're doing that. If I provided it in that wording, which when you're anonymous, it's easier to be less empathetic and all that kind of stuff. So we just kind of remind people, it's like, when you're providing feedback, do it in this way, you'll get better responses, all that kind of stuff. Again, it goes in with empathy, but recognition and reward. So I talked about this tool before, but really cool tool. It's called Bonusly. And it allows us to democratize recognition. So each team member gets 100 points at the beginning of the month, and they can basically recognize other team members. So you see here, Drew recognized Emily, and he said, something she did great in that meeting, and then put in some of our values like dedication, and then some of our story elements like ripple effect. And there's gifts and all kinds of fun stuff you can have there, but you're recognizing other team members. And so rather than only having, like, say, managers that don't see everything that's going on being able to recognize people. This actually surfaces a lot of the stuff that's going on and provides visibility to a lot of it, as well as making sure people are getting recognition more consistently from their peers. So this kind of recognition is really valuable because when you're doing work, you want to know that it's being valued, first of all, and that you're doing it well, and you want feedback, both when you're not and when you are, right? And so this provides that valuable feedback throughout that process and helps reinforce, um, our identity, our vision, our values, all the things that we want to do as far as being successful. And there's a lot of reporting, like, by which hashtag dedication is clearly large, chi goals, gratitude, all those things are really big. So you can look at those at different levels. So one thing I just want to say in kind of closing is I think it's really important, if your website isn't currently inclusive as far as being ADA compliant, having an experience that, whether someone has cognitive challenges, so like seizures or different things like that because of flashing, and being able to change some of those things, or auditory or visual, where they come to and they need a screen reader. If your website isn't set up to cater to those users, I highly recommend you just, like, we're happy to do a free audit for you, to help make your website more inclusive to everyone across the organization. And so there's if you want a free analysis, just go to web4.com/get started. We're happy to give you some insights, and then if you want solutions, we can also do that as well. So I just want to finish by saying, we believe businesses can be a really powerful catalyst for creating a better, happier, and more inclusive society. And my hope is that all of you watching will be a part of that change and empower your people and your organization to have those positive impact and ripple effects as well. So thank you so much. I appreciate everybody who's tuned in and listening. Feel free to comment, ask questions, and if you need anything, feel free to reach out. My contact information is right there. So, all right, have a great day. All right, that guy was long-winded. I don't know. No, I just wanted to open up and do some Q&A for anyone who has questions. It was a little longer than maybe some expected. So if you're watching this on video later or anything like that, feel free to throw questions, comments in the comment section, and I will address those as I can. So as you can tell, this is something I'm really passionate about and really enjoy, to be honest with you. And so I'm going to, in the tool I'm using, I see comments from some of the different social platforms as well. So I'm just going to look at some of those and address some of the different questions there. And then I'm providing a link to the steer worksheet that I mentioned. Let me make sure. Looks like it doesn't go out to LinkedIn through this tool for some reason, but it went out to YouTube and Facebook. So check those if you need the worksheet. Otherwise, I'll post it to LinkedIn a little bit later as well. So I'd see a question from Michael and want to address that. He mentions talking about the pain pleasure principle and saying, example, if I'm rarely working out and I tend to get pleasure from this, and I feel bad to miss even just one workout. But if I fall out of this routine, then I can fall into a feeling of pain when I even start to think about exercise. So, and then he talked about the steer method. So he said the steer method feels like it's built to help navigate and help me better understand these thoughts and cycles. And then the question as well is, can the steer method be used for both understanding negative patterns, thought processes, and for creating positive habits? And so the short answer is yes, it definitely can. And that's how I use it. It kind of goes back to, and I have very similar, have had, and sometimes still do have similar challenges with, behavioral change, because we have sometimes different competing things going on in our life, different values that we are trying to satisfy, different things like that. So I'll touch on a couple key things that I think are really important, because I think most of us go through life, and we are going through life in the riverbed for the most part. And so I think it's important to take time to move into that manual mode and establish a set of values. You have a clear vision for your life that is exciting to you, that like is your strong why, right? We talked about why being a really strong reason for behavioral change. So in this instance, if it's a kind of a personal goal like that, or whether it's a professional goal, creating a really strong vision that gets you excited, that is like you're really excited about achieving that, and it has a really strong why to it, is really important, right? And then one of the things that comes up is we often have competing whys. We have competing things in different areas of our life. And so we want to try to, the way I do it is try to organize my values. And when I say values in this context, I'm talking about mainly ways of being, right? Most of the things, a lot of times our goals are doing goals or having goals, which are good. And it's still good to have those goals. But when I'm talking about values, it tends to be more related to being goals. I want to be healthy, energetic, right? Things like that. I want to, be in a positive, like loving state. I want to, be the best father I can. I want to be the best husband I can. Whatever these different things are, right? So it's more about being goals, and then you want to sit there and kind of go through and prioritize them, because what often happens is you we it goes back to that whole get very clear about your intention and then align your attention with your intention, right? So you want to get very clear about your intention. Something that, like, I don't do it as much now, but something I used to do is every single day I'd read my vision, be reading my values, I'd be reinforcing it early in the morning, and something I would constantly be doing and looking at, because I was trying to recreate those patterns, right? And so steer is part of recreating those patterns, because you're basically creating new grooves. That water is very powerful, and when it's focused, right? If you've ever seen a laser jet or a water jet and cut through steel that's 12 inches thick, it's focused attention, right? So the quantity and quality of that attention in those areas, the repetition of that creates new patterns. And you want to also address the underlying areas. So one of the things you said that really resonated with me was that you can feel bad when you even start to think about it, because it's like you're feeling like you're not doing the thing that you set out to do, right? If even if you miss one workout. And so one of the things that took me a long time to realize was the being hard on myself was actually detrimental. There's a point at which it's detrimental to the behavior change you want, because at some point you just end up saying, well, I'm just not going to do it, because the pain of constantly not doing it starts to become a bigger weight than the pleasure of doing it, because there's other pains and things and competing priorities and so much stuff going on, where it's like, oh, all these things going on. So you want to get very clear about your intention. What are the ways of being that I want to be? This applies at the organizational level as well, right? So these things apply individual and organizational. You want to get very clear about them and prioritize them. And one of the things that I changed, I'd say 2 or 3 years ago, which has made a big difference in this exact area, was my my highest goals were contribution to others and financial, like, freedom, right? Those were two of my biggest goals, and those are very beneficial. But at the same time, my health was suffering to some extent too. And so what was interesting to me was, as I realized at one point that if I prioritize my own health, it's that physical, mental health, I'm actually going to be better at doing those other things. So sometimes it's kind of like the priority of, focusing on the internal customer so that the external customer is really taken care of. The same thing with you. You have to take care of the internal customer yourself so you can do better for those people you love. Because when you're super passionate and want to do other things, we can feel almost guilty when we do something for ourselves. And you want to make sure that you are taking care of yourself and just doing so consistently, and that you are also compassionate with yourself when you don't follow through because you have other things going on, but that you just realize over time you're creating this habit. You're also changing the underlying beliefs of those I am statements, right? Because those are really, really important. Eventually, you want to have this identity that I am a healthy, active person that like works out consistently, right? When you have those beliefs, it is much more powerful because you tend to stay true to your identity as opposed to I am, you know, putting other things there. All the things I used to say um, too about I am this, or I'd be like, I have a, you know, my metabolism. I'd say all these things that were not really beneficial. Again, some were true to some extent, but what were the other truths that were more beneficial? So, using the steer method, looking back at the result, looking back at the actions that you need to take, because it requires a lot of just consistent action. But it's more about the consistency over a long period of time, and not setting your goals on things that, like for me, I used to set my goals on a number of weight and things like that, and that could be detrimental for me in that specific instance. And so it was more about setting my goals on being healthy and energetic, and increasing my energy level. Because when I had a higher energy level, I was better to be there for my wife, for my kids, at my work, for my team, right? So those were what I kind of focused on, and then the other things came with it. So I think that that's really important. But you focus on the result, like what is the desired outcome? What are the actions that I need to take to do that? Whether it's exercise, 3 to 5 times a week or 3 to 4 times a week, just 30 minutes getting my heart rate up, and then food, things like that, diet, all those things. And so, what are the emotions or what are the underlying meanings that are associated with those things that would be empowering? The other part is looking at what are the meanings that I have currently that are detrimental, and realizing how to. Beliefs are kind of like tabletops. They have these supporting beliefs or experiences underneath them, and you you want to cut those legs out and basically deconstruct that belief with realizing other experiences, and then create a new stronger belief structure that has really good supporting beliefs underneath it. So anyways, super kind of detailed answer on that, but it's one I have a lot of personal experience with, so I thought I would share a little bit about that as well. I am going to stop there, and then I will follow up on any other questions, because we're already at an hour and 48 minutes. Um, if you're posting questions on some of the other social platforms, I'll look at later, and I will also try to address your questions there. But just wanted to say again, thank you so much. Have a great day. And